Welcome from the Moravian Archives. My name is Paul Poiker and I am archivist at the Moravian Archives here in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. Today's presentation is by Thomas McCullough, Moravians and Early American Holidays. Thomas is assistant archivist and holds a master's degree in applied history from Shippensburg University and a master's degree in library and information science from the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. In September, Tom was invited to speak at a conference at Wake Forest University in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. The theme of the conference was Becoming American, Moravians and Their Neighbors, 1772-1822. Since then, he has done further research on this topic, and I'm looking forward to hear what he has found. If you have any questions for our speaker, feel free to put them in the chat. After the lecture, the speaker is happy to take those questions. This lecture is going to be recorded. In order to protect your privacy, your video has been turned off, and please make sure you stay muted. And now, without further ado, I would like to hand it over to our speaker. Please join me in welcoming Thomas McCullough.
Hi, everyone, and thank you, Paul, for the warm introduction. I am going to bring up my PowerPoint now. Hopefully, you're just seeing my PowerPoint screen and not also my notes. Can everyone give me a thumbs up? Okay, awesome. Just my PowerPoint screen. So as Paul mentioned, this lecture is the product of research done in conjunction with a paper that I originally presented to the Becoming American Conference in September 2020. I'm grateful to Ulrika Wiethaus, who is here with us, Grant McAllister, and Eric Elliott for having invited me to present there. And I'm glad that this research can again be shared, not only in what will soon be an edited volume alongside the other papers that were presented in that conference, but also here virtually with people across the world on Zoom. So thanks for being here today. The title of my presentation is Moravians and Early American Holidays, but let's expand on that a bit and think of it as Moravians and the celebration of both American figures and holidays between the period of 1776 and 1826, the first 50 years of the United States. You're looking at the document that started me on this research quest. Yep, a lot of German script. 3 whole pages of handwritten text were necessary to recap Bethlehem's observation of George Washington's birthday on February 22nd, 1800. When first seeing this, I remember rather naively saying to myself, this is a rare example of early Moravian patriotism. I mean, after all, the diarist describes George Washington, this storied American figure, as a quote unquote instrument of the Lord. At this time, I became interested in the notion of both Americanization and the secularization of American Moravians. And I had already been acquainted with some previous works by Elizabeth Sommer, S. Scott Rohrer, Paul Poiker. Thank you for the introduction, Paul. Peter Vogt, Gillian Lint-Gollin, Daniel Cruz, Gisela Metala, Jared Burkholder, and really many others who have addressed related themes, be it the key components and challenges to Moravians' collective identity, or organizational issues of the worldwide Moravian Church that emerged during the 19th century. My research looks at festival days specific to the United States of America and considers Moravian engagement with them over time. In examining the records, hopefully I didn't just move that, okay. In examining the records of 19 Moravian congregations during the period of 1776 to 1826, my research revealed that patriotic sentiments, especially as experienced in American holidays, were not perceived as threatening to the collective identity of the worldwide Moravian Church, because a Moravian subtext could be applied to secular-oriented events. The experiences of the 4th of July especially demonstrate that it was instead insubordination which presented the greatest threat to the transnational imagined community. For both individualism and indifference towards church leadership could slowly chip away at the foundation of interconnectedness, so sustained by almost a century's worth of loyalty to the the church's strong central authorities. During Zinzendorf's time, there was no such thing as quote unquote patriotism, according to our modern sense of the word, writes Hans Christoph Hahn. American Moravians of the 18th century had a strong awareness of the cosmopolitan character of their settlements and of their collective identity as members of a transatlantic and worldwide church community, and an even larger community of believers, here embodied in a painter, Johann Valentin Height's group portrait of Moravian converts from around the world. Peter Vogt argues that the Moravian movement's homogeneity across political, national, and geographic boundaries reached the highest degree in the common spiritual life of Moravian communities during the 18th century. Moravians celebrated their common history through an endless cycle of festival days, memorial days, and more. A common interpretation of the past among church members is what helped establish a collective identity, maintained well into the 19th century, which Gisela Medela characterizes as a global community of remembrance. On top of church-specific holidays, it was also customary for Moravians to celebrate the holidays that were customary in the land in which they would be residing, in which a given congregation would reside. Before I go much further and discuss Moravians celebrating Washington's birthday, which I'll do in a bit, it's important to provide some context about Moravians and the reverence of mortal men and women. First, there is a long Moravian tradition of reverence towards religious figures, both with direct and indirect ties to the Moravian Church. By way of regular commemorative services, sometimes annual, American Moravians recalled the legacies of Christians whose impacts in the Moravian Church history were both profound and central to its development. And some examples would include Jan Hus, who's depicted here in a woodcut being burned at the stake in 1415. Moravians would celebrate that martyrdom on July 6th and continue to do so. And then we also have the example of Reformation Day and the celebration of Martin Luther's publication of his 95 Theses. It's generally celebrated around Halloween every year. Contemporary Moravian figures were celebrated as well. On May 9th, which happens to be my birthday, American Moravian congregations periodically recalled the life of Count Nicholas Ludwig von Zinzendorf, who had died on that day. Like Zinzendorf, other Moravian figures, often in spiritual leadership positions, were the subject of great admiration from fellow church members. As Moravians revered charismatic and faithful church leaders within their shared community, they also sought to maintain healthy relationships with their respective political authorities, to be loyal subjects. And this was especially true in mission areas, often controlled by the world's colonial powers. In the diaries of Moravian church congregations, we regularly see references to the biweekly church litany, wherein commendations were made to respective government figureheads, such as the King of England or Prussia, the President of the United States, the Governor of North Carolina or Pennsylvania, and other political authorities. Historically, American Moravians were keen to observe the government-proclaimed holidays in their respective territories, for this showed obedience and could be done in a manner suitable to Moravian doctrine. In 1763, Nazareth and Shennick Moravians, up here in Pennsylvania, following orders of colonial governor John Penn, recognized the peace treaty ending the French and Indian War with a special service of prayer and thanksgiving. Earlier in the same conflict, after the Battle of the Plains of Abraham, Bethlehem Moravians honored a similar request from the colonial government, sending ministers to the local county seat of Easton to preach there in the town circle. Government-appointed holidays continued to be unquestionably heeded by Moravian ministers well into the existence of the United States. In 1813, for instance, Lidditz Moravians, like other Pennsylvanians, observed the Pennsylvania governor's appointed day of repentance and prayer. He also happened to be a former Moravian, Simon Schneider. And they used meditations fit for the purpose for the occasion. Indeed, these few cases well illustrate that Moravians have been historically predisposed to engage in the holidays customary in the country in which they're residing. The actions of American Moravians, I would argue, in the Revolutionary era, which would be 1776 to 81, the Confederation period, taking us up to 1787, and the Federalist era, taking us up to 1800, all demonstrate that they sensed a strong affinity with venerable American figures. Moravians had great admiration for several Revolutionary era figures, especially military officers who treated them well and they considered reputable, such as Marquis de Lafayette, whose likeness graces the front cover of the Nazareth Diary for 1825 to 1826, Casimir Pulaski, who the Bethlehem Single Sisters made a U.S. banner for in the 1770s, and George Washington, whose in-person request for admission of a niece into their school, the Bethlehem Female Seminary, was the source of much pride for Moravians. Getting back to Lafayette, he had been wounded during the Battle of Brandywine and was nursed back to health in Bethlehem in 1777. His legacy, romanticized by the community, the room in the Beckel household where Lafayette healed remained a spectacle for visitors right on through to his grand return to America in 1825, hence that Nazareth Diary from 1825 with Lafayette's face. Now, it would be unfair to say that only the United States of America's authorities or heroes garnered a high level of respect from American Moravian congregations. Let's face it, had King George III of England visited the colonies and spent the night in Bethlehem or Salem, we might expect a similar reaction from the community, for indeed, some American Moravian congregations had celebrated his birthday in the days before the Revolutionary War, such as New York Moravians, who in May 1776, it's my understanding that they loaned church benches to the British General Howe so that the Queen's birthday could be celebrated. And then a month later, they decorated their parsonage with 38 candles for King George's birthday. So that's a month before the Declaration of Independence is signed. Still, what we find is that Moravian admiration of George Washington takes the celebration of authority figures to a new level. His legacy was iconic, and American Moravians, by and large, hoped and prayed for more political, quote, men with such wisdom, end quote. By the time of his death, Washington had truly emerged as a folk hero, an American symbol. And in Moravian diaries and other sources, he is regularly described in the German language as geliebt, that is beloved, and lieb, that is dear. And these are two modifiers of affinity that, in my experience, and I'm sure anyone else who's worked with Moravian records would say, these are modifiers of affinity typically exchanged between Moravian brothers and sisters. So when President Washington visited Salem, North Carolina in 1791, this was 2 years after his inauguration, he was greeted there in large crowds in the Salem Tavern. And to them, he supposedly said, "After all, good people, I am but a citizen of our free country, like you all. I thank you all for the honor shown me." He thereafter took his hands, he was a very tall man, and laid them on the heads of the young boys who would gather behind him in the Salem Tavern. And he offered them some encouraging words. And this was clearly such a definitive moment for Salem Moravians and the history of Salem congregation itself, that 25 years later, in a manuscript history of the Salem congregation, Ludwig David von Steinitz, this is in 1816, he devoted an entire paragraph to Washington's visit and the memory of that. George Washington's birthday was one of the most conspicuous American holidays that emerged during the Revolutionary War period. And it's still celebrated today. And there's one of the reasons that we picked this event for this week is obviously Washington's birthday was celebrated yesterday, also known as President's Day, and some points in time. So when did the Moravians start celebrating Washington's birthday? So among Moravians, the holiday was seemingly first observed by the Bethlehem Female Boarding School in February 1789. A few years later, in 1795, again on their own accord, Moravians celebrated, or Bethlehem Moravians, I should say, celebrated President Washington's birthday with Bishop Johannes Etvine's ode to, quote, Virginia's well-beloved son, a warrior and peacemaker. The president's birthday was simultaneously celebrated with the birthdays of Sister Susanna Zeisberger and old brother Grosh. This was a testament to local Moravians' affinity to Washington. You know, he celebrated in the same breath as if a brother or sister in the Moravian Church himself. When Washington passed away in December 1799, he was immortalized on his birthday 2 months later, on February 22nd, 1800. In their memorial service for Washington, the young women of the Bethlehem Female Seminary presented in song the late president and general as a quote unquote faithful servant of the Lord. Moravians eulogized his Christian beliefs and efforts to promote religious toleration. In Hope, New Jersey, Brother Andreas Bonata expressed appreciation and thanks to God for placing such, quote, wise, God-fearing, and it was a very long German word here, but I translated this as upholding of the Christian faith men at the helm, like General Washington. And then in Bethlehem, Brother Jakob van Vleck described Washington as a quote unquote instrument of the Lord who fought to preserve civil and ecclesiastical rights and freedoms for us, namely the Moravians, but then also the entire country. And finally, in Nazareth, Bishop Karl Gotthold Reichel called upon the congregants, especially children, to remember the extraordinary instrument in his hand, meaning the Lord's hand. Other accounts also speak of the general love and admiration that Moravians had for George Washington. In Nazareth, we read that the entire village, we in the whole village, esteem him from the depths of our hearts. Similarly, the death of our dear man and sovereign, our beloved general and President Washington, was a quote unquote painful loss to Lancaster Moravians. Their pastor actually felt compelled to justify his and the congregation's right to be mournful on the occasion, writing, "Of course, it is fair that one should grieve over such a death, just as the people of God did in the Old Covenant when they lost, for example, a Jacob, an Aaron, a Moses, a Josiah, and similar men, whom God had bestowed with salvation." Despite Washington's many years of active military service, American Moravians also desired to emphasize Washington's diplomatic efforts, especially with maintaining peace with warring powers in Europe. They focused on remembering him as a peacemaker. And something I thought about this is that as conscientious objectors, perhaps they were trying to remember him in a way that bestowed him with more Moravian-like qualities. And that's something that I think is important when we look at how Moravians are describing him. We also see a call, pardon me, gone too far. We also see a call from Bishop Karl Gotthold Reichel. "We shall remember him and tell our children of the work of this great man." Continuing, Reichel drew attention to several factors for Moravian admiration of Washington. First, for his quote unquote welfare of the United States, and second, for his quote unquote love and affection for the Brethren's Church and his willingness to grant official protection and support to the mission of the Brethren among the American Indians. So here we see that part of Moravian admiration for George Washington stems from the fact that they think he is sympathetic and supportive of Moravian interests. And hopefully these examples give a sense of just some of the many rapidly developing invented traditions that are coming about in the early Republic. Okay, so big jump here, but moving from memorialization of the individual to the nation, let's now take a look at Moravians and early celebrations of Independence Day for comparison. Now, I know this photo is a bit anachronistic. It's from 1890s, much later, and the subject of flags in a church is for another day. But let's move on to the next slide. Salem Moravian celebration of July 4th, 1783 has been the focus of scholars and journalists for quite some time, some even going as far to claim that Johann Friedrich Pater's Psalm of Joy, or Freudenpsalm, is the first patriotic song celebrating the nation's freedom. I actually take that from a headline, first patriotic song celebrating the nation's freedom. In reality, the Salem congregation was actually responding to an order from the governor of North Carolina to observe the day with the church services that would be appropriate for the occasion. Feelings on this day were of gratitude to the Lord for the restoration of peace. They were not by any means patriotic. They were not a celebration of British victory or American victory over the British, and they were not a celebration of being or becoming American. The Moravians were simply grateful that the war had concluded and there might be some return to normalcy in their communities. After this, as Daniel Cruz, former Southern Province archivist, has written, Independence Day celebrations in Salem, given their propensity for disorder, were discouraged over the next 25 years. So unlike the pageantry of this early 1783 celebration, we see that raucous celebrations were simply not in line with the expectations of decorum in Moravian Ortsgemeinden, or congregation places. Those congregation places are exclusive Moravian communities like Salem, Bethlehem, Nazareth, and Lidditz. Young brethren shooting off guns and engaging in other quote unquote worldly activities on the 4th of July were the subject of consternation in meetings of the Salem Overseers Committee in 1802, 1803, 1806, 1811, 1812, and 1814. So obviously this is something that concerned Moravians in Salem for a long period of time. Speaking of that concern, every year I fear this day and thank God that we're able to get by here without incident, once wrote Christian Ludwig Benzin, administrator of Moravians in Wachovia, North Carolina. Shooting festivities seem to have surfaced in Bethlehem beginning on July 4th, 1799, when 4 younger brothers fired sporadic gunshots after the evening worship service had concluded. In response, Bethlehem elders devoted time during the next worship service to present such behavior as disreputable and disorderly. The disorder continued to be problematic for church officials there well into the 1810s. From 1810 to 1812 alone, there are several dozen references to the celebration of July 4th. This is just in a 3-year span. There are over 36 references in the minutes of the Bethlehem Elders Conference to the celebration of July 4th. Lidditz Moravian Church, on the other hand, did celebrate Independence Day as a congregation in 1811, but also owing to the same problems of disorder, they didn't celebrate July 4th for the next 7 years. Shooting and cannonading in particular were initially perceived as disorderly by church leaders. Guns, cannons, marching militias, they all have some militaristic elements which do not easily conform to the ideals of pious pacifists like the Moravians. Moravian doctrine historically embraced conscientious objection and religious pacifism. And some congregations, such as Neudorp in Staten Island, New York, appear to have circumvented this, whereas in their own 1799 celebration of Independence Day, Brother Friedrich Moring emphasized that the majority of the military officers leading the day's festivities, these festivities including the firing of swivel guns, successive toasts of federalism, these festivities were led by Moravians who worshipped at Neudorp. So that is implicitly said by the minister, Friedrich Moring. Nonetheless, regulations in American Moravian communities prevented most able-bodied men from serving in military capacities until well into the 19th century, and church regulations were not to be taken lightly. The crux of the issue for American Moravian church leadership was outright insubordination occurring in their church communities. Characterizing the unruliness that had crept into the Moravian church in Bethlehem on July 4th, Wachovia administrator Bethlehem sadly told his northern colleague, Bishop Loskiel, "It is all the more clear, I think, that you have the real Satan against you. The warmest patriotism was permissible, and national sentiments were actually to be expected. In reality, it was the deterioration of quote unquote fraternal subordination that so troubled Benzin, as it did many of his American colleagues. In 1812, the Bethlehem elders observed with sadness that their bids for a solemn observation of Independence Day had not impressed on the minds of their congregants. Instead, what happened? Screams of hurrah poured out from the Moravians and strangers alike as the militia exited the town, some sisters and girls supposedly trailing the militiamen all the way to the Lehigh River. So that was seen as unbecoming in the Moravian community. In June 1812, after an open letter from Bishop Karl Gotthold Reichel was read aloud to the Salem congregation in North Carolina, this was advising against worldly manifestations on the upcoming Independence Day. A number of younger brethren responded by sticking cockades in their hats to show how little they regarded the warning. Just something about cockades, the wearing of such, especially during the period of when you're having very split party lines with Democratic Republicans and Federalists, might signify one's partisanship with a particular group. What we really learned from this that is more important is that no longer were young brethren simply brazen enough to just commit mischief in relative anonymity on July 4th. Rather, they were now publicly expressing discontent towards church polity, their faces not hidden in the obscurity of night. And Paul Poiker has written about a similar act of open defiance in the quote unquote Halba Revolt, the Halba Revolt that occurred just 3 years later in Nazareth, Pennsylvania, where Moravian women collectively showed up at church in Nazareth sporting a different style bonnet than the tradition Moravian Schneppelhaube. They had talked about this beforehand, and they decided to come to church wearing a different haube than was traditional in the Moravian community. After the 1812 debacle that I just described, Bethlehem's disgruntled elders contacted the Unity Elders Conference, which is the church's highest administrative board in Germany, and they contacted them for counsel. 2 years earlier, as we will read on this particular slide, Bishop Georg Heinrich Loskiel reported to the UEC, that's the Unity Elders Conference, that the young people involved in celebrating the Festival of American Freedom with shooting would be excluded from Holy Communion for their disobedience. For the UEC, Bishop Loskiel had overreacted, for this type of spirit or feeling, whatever you want to call it, was already in American blood. I love that quote. They reckoned it was also of the opinion that it would have been more advisable to show a bit more consideration for national sentiments. And they use the word Nationalgefühle, which we could translate a few ways. But I think it's interesting because they are saying to ignore these youthful expressions of joy, and especially when they have taken place outside of town. So we can see that Moravian church leaders in America over the next few years begin to exercise more and more flexibility towards these instances of what they deem to be misbehavior or worldly activities. We'll read a bit later that prior to the 50th anniversary of Independence Day in Lidditz, 1826, that the shooting of guns by young and old was carried out, beloved, and considered by church members to be inextricably connected with the celebration of Independence Day, a phenomena that the, quote, spirit of the congregation had not been able to suppress. Although the firing of cannons and warlike music did not match the identity of the Moravian Church, the Lidditz elders resolved, like their superiors here on this slide in Germany, that it wasn't feasible or advisable to attempt to subdue something so established in the local culture. Control in Moravian communities was shifting away from church administrators to the townspeople. When the Treaty of Ghent was signed, ending the War of 1812, citizens, this is the word used, citizens of Bethlehem approached Brother Johann Friedrich Staudiger, a member of the Elders Conference, expressing their desire to bear witness to the momentous occasion by illuminating their town. An agreement to do so was thereafter made in a meeting of town citizens on February 19th, 1815, to which Brother Staudiger was invited. Here we see a member of the Bethlehem Elders Conference being invited to a decisive meeting, rather than the citizens of Bethlehem being invited to comment on the meeting of the Elders Conference. This speaks to the growing agency of individual church members, as well as a growing sense of identity reinforced by citizenship, as church members are now being consistently called by the elders citizens on top of being called brothers and sisters. We also find that regular church services were routinely canceled by American Moravian church congregations due to these new secular holidays. On Independence Day in 1804, First Moravian Church of New York cited poor attendance, especially among children. In 1806, the same congregation thought best to drop our evening meeting on that day. And in 1810, the New York congregation wrote that not one soul attended the Wednesday worship service scheduled for July 4th. In the Bethlehem Diary from 1816, we read that the quote unquote evening worship service on the 4th of July was canceled, whereas at this time, the musicians, for the sake of today's celebrated day of the United States of America, struck up various chorales with their brass and wind instruments in front of the Bethlehem Female Boarding School. The same circumstances presented themselves a year later. It seems that decisions to cancel or postpone regular activities rested on two factors. First, attendance might be poor if there were public festivities during the same time frame. And second, there was a good chance that the noise and commotion from parading, cannonading, fireworks, and shooting was going to upstage planned services. Moravian church leaders sought to replace shooting, we'll see, with orderly celebratory forms, such as illuminations, love feasts, reading of texts, singing services, and if we think about it on a deeper level, to activities that are part of Moravian identity. On July 5th, 1819, Brother Jakob Rauschenberger and Brother Abraham Luckenbach helped lead Independence Day celebrations out in New Philadelphia, Ohio, with Luckenbach reading the Declaration of Independence before an oration was thereafter given by a local Freemason. On July 4th, 1825, in Salem, Brother Gotthold Benjamin Reichel spoke about what had happened when the Declaration of Independence was signed, and of the great good that has, quote unquote, come to this land. In 1826, the Declaration was also read aloud in the North Carolina Moravian community of Bethania. The Declaration, just a little bit about the Declaration, it had only again become relevant as a document of unified national significance in the aftermath of the War of 1812. The public reading of such in a Moravian sanctuary or in the course of a Moravian-led church service may have served to reinforce a popular shared history between Moravians and their neighbors. The Declaration quickly became a cornerstone of integrative rituals built around it. However, it wasn't the only symbol employed by Moravians to capture the spirit of the revolution. We'll hear more about this number 50 in a little bit. Even simple elements like numbers can be symbolic. During the first 4th of July celebration in Philadelphia in 1777, festivities ended and began with 13 fireworks, alluding to the 13 colonies. On July 4th, 1815, Grayson Moravian Church in Maryland fired off 18 cannon shots to celebrate the number of states admitted to the Union at that point in time, thereby establishing some continuity between 1776 and the current state of the nation. In Bethlehem, in accordance with a resolution from the Congregational Council, a 50-gun salute ushered in a whirlwind of elaborate services and pageantry. In the words of Hans Christoph Hahn, patriotic content had essentially been woven into the traditional fabric of Moravian church life, from bells to trombone choirs to festive sermons, and now to church decorations. Now, this image that I have up on the screen actually comes from a Bethlehem anniversary celebration in 1842. But I hope that this image helps us visualize the following descriptions of Independence Day, namely from Lititz, Pennsylvania, and from Grayson, Maryland. On July 4th, 1826, a large pyramid with 50 multicolored lamps illuminated the facade of Lititz Moravian Church. After multiple services throughout the day, a singing service, or Singstunde, of Thanksgiving was held in the Saal in the evening, whereby one could glimpse around the room. There stood a boxwood cutout of the number 50, celebrating 50 years of American independence, visible in the pulpit above a biblical passage from Isaiah in German. Then there was the word German on a window at left, and below that, the word religion on a window at left, and below that, the year 1776. The word Tugend, meaning virtue, was on the opposing window, and the current year, 1826, below this. Then there were oval-shaped wreaths of spruce stretching from across the choir loft and as high as the roof of the church, featuring the names of the original 13 American colonies in gold letters, emphasizing their historical value. The names of the 24 existing states in the Union in 1826 appeared above the liturgist bench in italic font, and this was again illuminated by 50 candles. And finally, besides other small decorations, there were 2 large but quote unquote tasteful spruce garlands tying everything in the space nicely together. It would be fun to be able to see all of the things that are being described in this entry, but we can use our imagination, of course. Grayson Moravian Church in Maryland also installed a pyramid outside of its church, and they built it with 50 burning candles, before which the trombone choir stood, and they played some lovely tunes. And from the belfry of the church in Grayson, Sister Kluge and her choir singers sang psalms and chorales. All of the elements used in these 2 descriptions from Lititz and Grayson are quite reminiscent of the 50th anniversary celebration of the organization of the Bethlehem congregation. That 1792 Gemeinfest featured flowers, numbers in gold letters, various words and years on the church wall, and an outdoor pyramid structure covered in lights and other objects. Bethlehem's 1842 Gemeinfest, which you see an interior shot of here, featured such a pyramid as well. Therefore, while it would be interesting to say that the Independence Day pyramids that I was seeing in these entries had something to do with paying homage to, say, the pyramid which appears on the Great Seal of the United States. It's a symbol that you see on the dollar bill, represents the country's strength and duration. But I think from these other examples that we have in sacred events, it's safe to assume that Moravians were simply recycling some of their traditional and symbolic forms of pageantry in observing national holidays. I want to now briefly talk about setting and tradition. Johann Friedrich Pater's Cantata and Love Feast Ode, composed and first played in 1783, has been performed by Salem Moravians annually on July 4th since its reintroduction during the 200th anniversary year of the Salem congregation in 1966. Earlier in my presentation, you saw a transposed 1975 edition, but I also want to let you know that the Moravian Music Foundation is working on a new edition. So keep an eye out for that. Nowadays, every year, folks gather in the morning on the same square in Salem to hold a naturalization ceremony for new US citizens. And in the 19th century, Moravians and their neighbors would gather on what was formerly the orchard to the east of Salem's home church. It's now a newer part of the cemetery. In Lidditz, PA, Lidditz Spring Park has been the home of the Moravian community's Independence Day celebrations since 1818. And beginning in 1817, Nazareth Moravian Church would hold its outdoor Independence Day festivities in the pleasure garden of Nazareth Hall. And this was the Moravian boarding school for boys. Throughout the year 1826, we see that Nazareth Moravians and their neighbors would gather here in large crowds to take in fireworks, fire off guns and cannons, listen to the trombone choir and other musicians. But most importantly, they would affirm meaning in the political narrative of the day by their mere presence on this common ground. They kept returning to the same place, inventing a tradition. Speaking of audience, pastors often relate the presence and sometimes strong presence of neighbors in connection with their services commemorating American figures and holidays. And this is mentioned in Friedberg in Bethania, North Carolina, on a day that was appointed by George Washington for praise and prayer. It was mentioned again in Hope, New Jersey, when they celebrated Washington's birthday in 1800. And it was mentioned again in Nazareth's 50th anniversary celebration of Independence Day, that it, quote unquote, attracted a large crowd in the evening as Nazareth Hall and the market house were illuminated. In times wherein Moravian congregations did not plan American commemorative events, it was not unusual for Moravian pastors and church members to indulge in the celebrations hosted by their non-Moravian neighbors. Okay. I just want to move on here. Finally, we have addresses described as orations by Moravian ministers. In 1826, Brother Ludwig David von Schweinitz opened the afternoon service in Bethlehem's Central Moravian Church with an oratory, not only in connection with the 50-year anniversary of Independence Day, but also he spoke about the, quote, merits and advantages enjoyed in their prosperous fatherland. In Salem that same year, the pastor writes that the congregation took a happy share in the celebration of the anniversary, thankful for the enjoyment of civil freedom and rights as citizens, praying that these might continue. We also see eventually that pastors begin to use scripture in part of their grounding of Independence Day celebrations. On July 4th, 1799 in Staten Island, Brother Friedrich Moring preached over 1 Peter 2:16, as free and not using your liberty for a cloak of maliciousness, but as servants of God. Here, I'll just show you a few more examples that came up from Lancaster, from Shennick Moravian Church in Pennsylvania. And here are a few more. Probably the most fantastic one is the one at the end here in Lancaster from Exodus 13:3. This is a popular image that came up even in 1777. Pastors in New England would use this passage talking about being delivered from bondage, and they compared Great Britain to a greater than Egypt's power that was keeping them in bondage. So just to summarize what I've been able to find, scholars have claimed that the observance of Independence Day succeeded in fostering national consciousness in the Revolutionary and Confederation periods. But research to this point would reveal that this holiday did not have a captivating effect on the majority of American Moravians until much later. American Moravians did, however, enter the Federalist era, showing strong admiration for America's national heroes. During the Jeffersonian era, observances of Independence Day often took place, but were a thorn in the side for church officials. After the peace treaty was signed by the United States and Britain in 1815, we see church leaders' acquiescence to the observation of Independence Day, both to appeal to younger generations and in the words that they use that suggest a sense of belonging to a nation state. And finally, they continue to share this history by mingling with their neighbors. And in so doing, Moravian pastors eventually become active agents in grounding historical and national consciousness in such celebrations, such as reading the Declaration of Independence to congregants. And they also use rhetorical devices in celebrating Independence Day through their discourses. What we finally find is that by 1826, Independence Day can be recognized by American Moravians in the words of then Moravian minister at Lititz Moravian Church, an important Memorial Day. So I just want to leave you with this quote from the period that follows 1826, because that's where I left off. And I thank you all for taking the time to join me today.
Thank you for this presentation. I thought it was particularly interesting that you looked at different Moravian congregations in different parts of the country and also looked at them over a longer period of time, so you could see some developments and changes happening. Mm-hmm. Talking about shooting, can you say something about why that was such a huge issue in the early years?
That's a great question. I guess I would start by saying that the way that it was done, especially, it wasn't sanctioned. So when the first issue arose in 1799 in Bethlehem, and after the church service, you had younger brethren, 4 exactly, went off and were shooting guns in the middle of the night. They woke up everyone in the congregation, and this really upset this really upset church leadership, because this was not something that the young men in the community were supposed to be doing. It really lacked the decorum of a peaceful, quiet, modest Moravian way of life. And on top of that, I think that with shooting, there's also always militaristic elements to this. And I think that the ministers especially would have preferred a more orderly, Moravian-like procession on a secular holiday like that. Because the big thing that I've come away with, and this is Gisela Medela has done research on this, and she talks about bourgeois society in the 19th century. And she talks about how there was a separation of spheres for most people. For most Americans, there was a separation of spheres. There was economic rights, there were political rights, but for the Moravians, life, the church life was not private. It was part of life. So listening to the church's wishes as authorities was extremely important.
Thank you. I would like to invite everyone, if you have a question, just put it in the chat. You find the chat at the bottom of your screen, and you can type it in there. And we will make sure that that these questions come to Tom.
Very good.
let me see here. I see a question here from Ulrike Wheathouse in Winston-Salem. Do you know whether enslaved Moravians would participate in any of the celebrations, especially Independence Day?
That's a fantastic question, Ulrike. One thing that is an inherent limitation of this study is that there are not voices of, especially in the recapitulation of holidays, we don't really see the voices of how both Black and American Indian Moravians worshipped and celebrated Independence Day. And we also don't know how, how much citizenship plays a large role in people's constructions of self, and whether someone might have felt a strong identity, political identity as part of a country without all the rights of other Americans. That's not something that I've really been able to cover in this, and I think it's a really important thing. I will say that one interesting thing, if I was able to go further with the study, I know that beginning in 1829 in Bethlehem, they began using the 4th of July to take up collections towards the American Colonization Society. So that was the day, July 4th would be the day where collections would be taken up towards the American Colonization Society, and which supported and encouraged free Black Americans to move to Africa. And that was something that the Moravians would take up collections towards on July 4th, beginning in 1829.
Some people have just joined us in the last couple of minutes. I have a feeling that the issue is the different time zones that we're all in. We have a huge audience in Europe and here in the United States, and we're not all in the same time zone. But if you want to look back, we will have a recording up on our website in a couple of days, so you can see the whole thing there. There are some questions here, and I'm not really sure because they go beyond what you research, but still maybe you have something to say about that. Josef Kustelbauer is wondering if you found any material on how German Moravians or the Unity Elders Conference regarded George Washington or other revolutionary heroes. Because Washington was popular in Europe in the late 18th century. Did you find anything about that?
I didn't. It's a really interesting, it's definitely a really interesting thought. The only thing that I did that really I brought in from, which it would be helpful to bring in more. I mean, it's important not to look at history in a vacuum and totally focus on how Americans are commemorating and memorializing George Washington, but also how others are. One thing that I did find that involved Germany and at least a similar activity that took place, the only thing that was remotely similar is that in 1816 in Silesia, one of the Moravian congregations, Gnadau, built a pyramid in front of their church in January 1816 to recognize the succession of Prussian, or to recognize Prussian succession, which is really the only time that in my paper I really brought up Germany. So I think that would be fantastic to go back and try to bring in that perspective. So thank you, Josef.
Yes. Do you know anything about pacifism in the Moravian tradition and when that disappeared? Stephanie Goodling is asking that. At what point in history did Moravians go from this collectively pacifist mindset to being more part of the mainstream, where at least some are part of okay with military service?
I know it was in the 19th century. I wish I could say the exact date. Maybe you know, Paul. I think that's a great question. I know it wasn't early in the 19th century, it was in maybe the first quarter of the 19th century, and it's kind of representative of the change, the organizational changes that are occurring in the Moravian Church in the 19th century. I know that in the 19th century, you have a boarding school like Nazareth Hall develops into almost a cadet military school. So that's a major change. and that there would be military exercises and drill there. Some of the people that went to school there fought against one another in the American Civil War, that were from North Carolina and from Pennsylvania. So it's early enough that people that worshiped at that school had fought or that attended that school. Paul, do you know the exact date? I'm sorry to put you on the spot.
I just know that during the Civil War, there was not much discussion about Moravians participating in a military role. So by then, most of the pacifist ideals had been set aside or forgotten. Mm-hmm. The questions seem to be coming in right now. We have a couple of more minutes here. Let me see what we have here. A lot of people are saying they really enjoyed the presentation.
Thank you.
David Bloom from the Moravian Music Foundation is adding a comment. Another interesting perspective of the Moravian regard for American figures is that soon after the deaths of Jefferson and Franklin, on the 50th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence, Mozart's Requiem was performed in their honor. And I suppose that happened here in Salem.
That's fantastic, Dave. Thank you for making that comment. It is in my larger paper that is in the chapter, because it's also just like a crazy coincidence that two former presidents died on July 4th, 1826. And one of the reasons that I use that in my paper is not so much that they performed Mozart's Requiem, but the fact that the citizens of Bethlehem held a town hall to discuss how they were going to mourn the death. And they did so in August. But I think that's kind of why I really liked it, because the church really, I know that the church was part of that decision, but it is interesting that the citizens of Bethlehem organized to figure out how they were going to memorialize the two late presidents.
I would like to read these questions, and I don't expect you to have an answer. They're more rhetorical questions. They come from Carol Daig in Lancaster. It's a Moravian pastor, a retired Moravian pastor. It's interesting to note how we struggle with similar issues of secularization today. How do we deal with national athletic, social events that compete for our time and loyalties? Do we accept some of today's ideas, activities in order to get new members? Maybe we will take the following as the last question, since we are at the time. This is, can you say anything about women following the militias parade? Were women doing that? Why did they do that? Any eyewitness accounts by the women themselves?
The only thing that I can say about it is that I know that it was something that really upset the Bethlehem Elders Conference. That particular fact that I think it was just cheerful. It's really not. There's really, like, if you look at it from a 21st century perspective, it's really not, people are just following the parade, enjoying the parade, but it's just the idea that it's not supposed to happen. There's a strong separation of choir system in Bethlehem, of men and women, especially not interacting a whole lot in daily life, or not interacting directly so much in daily life. And I think this is maybe seen as a problem by the Elders Conference. It might be, there might be some sort of account from Moravian women in the Bethlehem Single Sisters diary. So that would be interesting to look at for sure. Because, that's an important thing to remember, is that a lot of the history written by the elders especially is written by Moravian men and their recapitulation, and it's their memory of the events. So yeah, I think it is important probably to look back at that. So thank you, Ulrika.
Very good.
Thank you. Thank you all for some good questions. There are more questions in the chat, but unfortunately our time is up. If you're interested in this topic, Tom's paper will be published. There's going to be a volume with the papers from the conference that, at Wake Forest. But like it is with many publications, we have to be patient until the publication is there. Until then, you can watch the recording, and in a couple of days, that will be up on our website. Our next event is on Tuesday, March 9th, again at 4 o'clock Eastern Time. And our presenter will be Richard Pointer, who will speak about finding peace on a violent frontier, Papoonhank and Native Moravians in Pennsylvania and Ohio. And you can sign up by clicking the link on our website. Many thanks to Thomas McCullough, and many thanks to you for watching, and hope to see you again. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Take care.
Wow. Interesting.